They called him the Devil of the Dust, a man whose shadow was longer and colder than a winter night in the high desert. But the most dangerous thing about Thomas Brennan wasn't the Colt peacemaker hanging low on his hip. It was the profound, dead emptiness in his eyes. He rode into Copper Ridge, Arizona, on a horse as black as his own reputation, and the town held its breath. The silence that fell over the dusty main street wasn't the kind born of respect. No, sir. It was the thick, choking silence of pure, undiluted fear. Men who were halfway through a joke would let the punchline die on their lips. Hands would twitch toward their own guns before they remembered who they were looking at, and then they'd find something incredibly interesting to look at on the floor. He was a ghost who walked in the daylight, a walking story of violence and loss that everyone had heard but no one dared to repeat in his presence. They said he'd put 12 men in the ground in fair fights, and maybe twice that many in fights that weren't so fair. They whispered he'd once worn a marshal's star back before something happened in Tombstone, something so dark that the name of the town itself became a curse. They said he'd lost everything a man could lose, and in doing so, had decided nothing would ever matter to him again. And for 3 long years, they were right. He was a force of nature, a dust devil of a man, moving from one forgotten town to the next with no purpose but to keep moving. What they didn't know, what no one could see past the legend, was that Thomas Brennan was tired, a soul-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could ever fix. He was tired of the weight of his own name, tired of the way people flinched when he walked by, tired of the cold steel that was his only companion in the lonely hours before dawn. He was a prisoner in a jail of his own making, and he'd long since lost the key. He swung off his horse in front of Morrison's trading post, the clink of his spurs the only sound in a world gone quiet. He pushed through the doors and the air inside grew heavy, the handful of ranchers and townsfolk scattering like quail. He needed ammunition. He needed tobacco. And then he was going to ride on, just like he always did. But that was before he saw her, and that was before she smiled. She stood in a corner of the store most folks ignored, a section filled with goods for the nearby Apache reservation. Blankets woven with the patterns of the earth, beads that held the color of the sky, things that felt like they belonged to an older, quieter world. Her skin was the color of sun-warmed clay, and her hair was a river of black ink, braided with small turquoise beads that caught the dusty light. When his eyes met hers, the world seemed to stop on its axis. Every other person in that store, in that town, in his entire life, had looked at him and seen a monster. They'd looked away in fear, in judgment, in hatred, but she didn't look away. She held his gaze, and in her eyes he didn't see a killer. He didn't see a legend or a ghost. He saw a man. And then the impossible happened. A small, almost imperceptible lifting at the corners of her mouth. A smile. It wasn't big, it wasn't bold, but it struck Thomas Brennan with more force than any bullet he'd ever taken. It was a crack of light in a tomb of darkness. It was a memory of a language he thought he'd forgotten how to speak. Kindness. Kindness offered freely, with no questions asked, with no fear attached. The nervous clerk, Peterson, was fumbling with his ammunition, his hands shaking so badly a few cartridges spilled onto the counter. Thomas didn't notice. He couldn't look away from her. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was quiet, with a soft accent that made the simple words sound like a song he'd heard a long, long time ago. The entire store was frozen, watching this insane, impossible moment unfold. The feared gunfighter and the Apache girl. Thomas felt like a man learning to walk again. He remembered a gesture from a life he'd lived a century ago. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat. It felt foreign, rusty. "Morning, ma'am." He managed to get the words out, his own voice sounding rough and unfamiliar in the quiet. "Ayanna," she said, her smile remaining. "Ayanna Yazzie." She said his name next, Thomas Brennan. And if the name meant anything to her, if the bloody stories had reached her ears, she gave no sign. She just went back to sorting a stack of colorful blankets, her movements graceful and calm, as if she were completely unaware of the invisible storm of tension that was swirling around them. As if she hadn't just done the single most dangerous thing a person could do in Copper Ridge: treat Thomas Brennan like a human being. And in that moment, Thomas knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't leaving town today. "You are new to Copper Ridge," Ayanna said. And it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, her eyes glancing up from the blankets for just a second. Thomas found himself leaning against the counter, a thing he never did. He never relaxed, never let his guard down. But something about her presence felt safe. "Just passing through," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. It was what he always said. She gave a small, knowing nod. "Most men say that. Few of them actually leave." There was a playful challenge in her tone, a hint of something that wasn't fear. It was curiosity. It made him want to do something he hadn't done in years. It made him want to smile back. Before he could think of a reply, a voice cut through the spell. "Brennan." It was Deputy Hayes, a young man who looked like his badge was wearing him instead of the other way around. He was sweating, and it wasn't just from the Arizona heat. He'd clearly spent the last 10 minutes working up the nerve to approach. "Sheriff wants to see you." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on Ayanna for a moment longer. "Miss Yazzie," he said, a formal farewell that felt strangely intimate. "Mr. Brennan," she replied, and the way she said his name, it sounded less like a curse and more like a possibility. He followed the nervous deputy out into the blinding sun. The smile still burned into his mind. He had a meeting with the law, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't on the wrong side of it, or at least he was on a side he hadn't chosen yet. Sheriff Marcus Coltrane was a man made of granite and grit. His office was clean, organized, and smelled of coffee and discipline. He didn't waste time. "Heard you rode in," he said, his gray eyes missing nothing. "News travels fast in a town this size, especially when it concerns men with your reputation." Coltrane leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. "I'll be plain. This is a peaceful town. I intend to keep it that way." Thomas stood before the desk, his duster settled around him like a shroud. "I've got no quarrel here, Sheriff." "Glad to hear it," Coltrane said, though his eyes said he wasn't convinced. "But trouble has a way of finding men like you, Brennan, whether you're looking for it or not." "Just passing through," Thomas repeated, the lie feeling thinner this time. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Question is, when are you passing out?" It was a fair question, and Thomas realized with a jolt that he didn't have an answer. 3 years he'd been drifting, but for the first time, the thought of moving on felt wrong. Was it the town, or was it the girl with the kind eyes? "Few days," he said. "Maybe a week. Got some business." "What business?" the sheriff pressed. "Looking for work," Thomas said, sticking as close to the truth as he dared. Coltrane studied him for a long, silent moment, weighing the man against the legend. "There's always work for a man with a fast gun," he finally said. "Just make sure it's the legal kind." The conversation seemed over. Thomas turned to leave, but the sheriff's voice stopped him at the door. "Brennan." Thomas looked back. "That girl at the trading post, Ayanna Yazzie." The sheriff's face was unreadable. "She's under the protection of the territorial government in the Apache Nation. A special arrangement. Just thought you should know." Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't a casual piece of information. It was a warning. "Why would I need to know that, Sheriff?" Coltrane's eyes were like chips of flint. "Because a girl like that, she attracts attention. The wrong kind. And men with reputations like yours, you tend to stir the pot. Just stay clear of her. It's for her own good." The warning was clear. Stay away. But as Thomas walked out of the sheriff's office, the message he'd actually heard was very, very different. Ayanna wasn't just some girl. She was important, and she was in danger. The Copper Ridge Hotel was run by a woman named Mrs. Chun, a tiny Chinese woman with a spine made of railroad steel. She laid out the rules with the precision of a drill sergeant. No fighting, no drinking in the rooms, no trouble. Break the rules, you're out. Thomas agreed to everything. He just wanted a room with a window. And from the window of room 12, he had a clear view of the street, a clear view of Morrison's trading post. He watched the afternoon sun bake the dust on the street, his mind replaying that small smile over and over. He was a man drowning, and she'd thrown him a lifeline without even knowing it. He'd been in the room for less than an hour when he saw them. 3 riders. They didn't look like ranchers or miners. They sat their horses with a lazy, arrogant slump that screamed predator. Their gear was too expensive, their guns worn in a way that spoke of constant, casual use. The leader, a tall man with pale, straw-like hair and a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, dismounted and swaggered toward the trading post. His 2 companions followed, their eyes scanning the street like wolves sizing up a herd of sheep. Thomas didn't know them, but he knew the type. The kind of men who saw beauty and wanted to break it, who saw peace and wanted to shatter it. He watched them disappear inside the trading post. A minute passed, then another. Then 2 townsfolk scurried out the door, their faces pale, their shopping forgotten. They practically ran down the street, not looking back. A cold, familiar dread washed over Thomas. It was happening. The trouble the sheriff had warned him about wasn't on its way. It was already here. Without a second thought, without a conscious decision, he found himself strapping on his gun belt. His hands moved with an old, deadly familiarity. He wasn't thinking about the sheriff's warning to stay away. He was thinking about a kind smile in a dusty room. And he was thinking that he'd be damned if he let anyone wipe that smile off her face. The trading post was silent. Not the quiet of a lazy afternoon, but the heavy, charged silence of a room holding its breath. The nervous clerk, Peterson, was gone. Vanished. The owner, Morrison, stood frozen behind his counter, his face a mask of sweat and terror. And in the back, by the Apache goods, they had her cornered. The straw-haired leader was leaning in close, his voice a low, greasy purr. "Now don't be unfriendly, darling. We're just asking for a little information." "I have told you," Ayana's voice was steady, but Thomas could see the rigid line of her shoulders. "The agent at the reservation is the one you should speak with." "Our business ain't with no government agent," the second man snarled, a short, stocky man with cruel eyes. "It's with some folks who might be resting out on your land, hiding from their responsibilities." Ayana stood her ground, her chin held high. "No one is hiding on the reservation. The Apache Nation honors its treaties." The third man, a young kid trying way too hard to look tough, actually spat on the floor. "Treaties? Your people break them whenever it suits you." The leader, Pike, moved even closer, invading her space. "Maybe you need a lesson in manners, girl." He reached for her arm, and that's when Thomas decided the time for silence was over. "Maybe," a low voice rumbled from the front of the store, "you're the one who needs the lesson." 3 heads whipped around. 3 hands darted for their guns, then froze in midair. They saw the duster. They saw the cold eyes. They saw the hands resting inches from the worn leather holster. And they saw death standing there, patient and waiting. Recognition flickered in the leader's eyes. A flicker of shock, then calculation. "Well, well," he said, slowly moving his hand away from his gun. "Thomas Brennan, I heard you were still breathing." Thomas took a slow step forward, his spurs echoing like a death knell in the silence. "Heard the same about you, Pike. Can't say I'm pleased to be wrong." Jake Pike. The name hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. A snake. A man who specialized in backshooting and preying on the weak. They'd crossed paths years ago, and Pike had left 2 of his own men dead to save his own skin. He was a coward, but a smart, vicious coward, and that made him dangerous. "Now, Tom, don't be like that," Pike said, his charming smile back in place. But it didn't reach his eyes. "We were just having a friendly conversation with the lady." "Conversation's over," Thomas said, his voice flat and cold as a tombstone. "Time for you and your boys to ride out." Pike's eyes narrowed. He was doing the math. 3 of them against 1 legend. Was the business that brought him here worth dying for? Was Thomas Brennan still as fast as the story said he was? For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the buzzing of a fly against the windowpane. Finally, Pike's smile returned, colder than ever. "Another time, then." He tipped his hat to Ayana. "Miss Yazzie, a pleasure." He turned to leave, but paused as he drew level with Thomas. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper. "Interesting company you're keeping these days, Brennan. Didn't figure you for a man who'd take up with Indians." Thomas didn't flinch. And I didn't figure you for a man who'd run from a fair fight, Jake. I guess we're both full of surprises. Pike's jaw tightened, but he just chuckled and walked out the door, his men trailing behind him like spooked coyotes. The danger was gone, but as the silence settled again, Thomas turned to look at Ayanna. He expected to see relief, gratitude. What he saw instead was something that confused him entirely. It was a flicker of anger. He expected a thank you, a nod of appreciation, something. Instead, Ayanna smoothed the front of her dress and went back to arranging the blankets on her table as if nothing had happened. The tension in the store began to dissipate. Morrison let out a long, shaky breath and started wiping down his counter with a rag. Peterson, the clerk, cautiously emerged from whatever crate he'd been hiding behind. Thomas walked toward her, a strange sense of unease settling over him. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She looked up at him, her dark eyes unreadable. "I am fine," she said, her tone crisp and formal. "Thank you, but that was unnecessary." Thomas blinked. Unnecessary? He just faced down 3 armed men for her. Unnecessary? He repeated, bewildered. They had you cornered. For the first time, her calm composure cracked, and a flash of fire lit her eyes. "And I was handling the situation," she said, her voice low but intense. "By being polite, by being patient, by letting them talk until they grew bored and left, by not turning a tense moment into a shootout in the middle of the store." The words stung because they were laced with a truth he couldn't deny. He had reacted with the only tool he had left, violence. He had seen a nail, and he had been a hammer. He hadn't considered the consequences for her, for the woman who had to live in this town long after he rode away. Men like Pike didn't forget a humiliation. He hadn't solved a problem for her. He had just created a bigger, more dangerous one down the road. "You're right," he said, the admission costing him more than he would have thought. "I apologize." His immediate agreement seemed to throw her off. She had clearly been expecting an argument, a defense of his actions. The anger in her eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of the same curiosity she'd shown him earlier. "You apologize?" she asked, as if the word was foreign to her. "Pike will be back," he said, his voice grim, "and he'll be angrier than he was today. Part of that is on me. I should have thought of that." She studied his face, and a hint of that first smile returned. "Perhaps," she allowed, "but it is also true that they might have become much bolder if no one had challenged them. Your intentions, they were honorable. So thank you, Mr. Brennan." A strange current passed between them in that moment, an understanding. They were 2 very different people, shaped by 2 very different worlds, but they had both just seen something true in the other. He saw a strength in her that had nothing to do with weapons, and she, it seemed, saw an honor in him that had nothing to do with his reputation. The words came out of his mouth before he could stop them. "Would you walk with me?" She looked surprised. "Walk where?" "Nowhere in particular," he said. "Just walk and talk." She considered it, her gaze sweeping over the other people in the store, who were now openly staring and whispering. "People will talk," she said quietly. "Let 'em," he replied, and was surprised by how much he meant it. For the first time in years, he truly didn't care what anyone thought. "They will say things about us, things that are not true." He looked her straight in the eye. "Do you care what they say?" She tilted her head, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. "Do you?" And Thomas Brennan, the devil of the dust, the man who lived by fear and isolation, gave the only answer he could. "No," he said, "I don't." And as they walked out of the trading post together, into the golden light of the late afternoon, he felt something shift deep inside him. It wasn't just the end of his loneliness. It was the beginning of a fight for something more than just survival. They walked away from the main street, away from the prying eyes and whispered gossip, following a small, dusty path that led toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to the vast open desert. The air was warm and smelled of sage and dust. For a while, neither of them spoke. It was a comfortable silence, a rare thing for Thomas. He was a man used to silences that were filled with threat and suspicion. This was different. This was peaceful. You have been to many places, Ayanna said, her voice drawing him from his thoughts. Too many, he admitted. And what do you see? She asked. When you look at them? The towns? The people? He thought for a moment, the answer coming to him with a familiar, bitter taste. I see the same things mostly. Every town's got a saloon full of men looking to forget, a sheriff trying to hold it all together, and a graveyard full of men who thought violence was the answer. He kicked at a loose stone on the path. The names on the signs change, but the story's always the same. That is a sad way to see the world, she said gently. He shrugged. Maybe, but it's accurate. Is it? She countered, stopping to look at him. Or is it just the only thing you've allowed yourself to see? Before he could answer, she led him to a flat-topped rock overlooking the valley. The desert stretched out before them, a breathtaking tapestry of red rock and purple shadows under the setting sun. This is where I come, she said, sitting on the rock. When the town becomes too much, too full of their fears. Fear of what? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Of change, she said. Of anything that is different. Of my people, who remind them that this land was not always theirs to claim. She looked at him then, her gaze direct and piercing. Does it not bother you, Thomas Brennan? Living among so many people who are afraid of you? The question hit him square in the chest. He'd never thought of it that way. He was the one who was dangerous, the one who was feared. But she was right. He lived his life surrounded by fear, just as she did. It was the water they both swam in. I suppose I do, he said, his voice quiet. He sat down on the rock next to her, the first time he'd willingly sat so close to another person in years. The difference is, she said softly, you chose this. You built this reputation. You made yourself into something to be feared. I was simply born. The truth of her words was a heavy weight. He had chosen this path. He had cultivated the fear, used it as a shield to keep the world away, to keep himself from getting hurt again. But in doing so, he had built a prison, not a fortress. Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What happened to you? And looking into her eyes, which held no judgment, only a deep and genuine compassion, Thomas Brennan did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He told the truth. He told her about his life before, about being a marshal in a small town outside Tombstone. He told her about his wife, Mary, and his little girl, Beth, with hair the color of corn silk. He told her about hunting the Hutchkins gang, a pack of rabid dogs who were terrorizing the territory. His voice grew thick as he spoke of his own pride, his own foolishness. I should have waited for backup, he said, his hands clenching into fists. But I was young, and I was arrogant. I went after them alone. He stared out at the horizon, but he wasn't seeing the sunset. He was seeing smoke and fire. They got away, and while I was chasing ghosts in the hills, they came back. They hit the town. They burned it. And they... His voice broke. He couldn't say the words. He didn't have to. Ayanna reached out and placed her small, warm hand over his clenched, scarred fist. The simple touch was like a dam breaking inside him. A flood of grief and rage and guilt he'd held back for so long threatened to overwhelm him. You don't know me, he choked out, trying to pull his hand away. You don't know the things I've done. I know what you did today, she said, her grip firm. I know you stood up for me, and I know what you are doing now. You are finally letting someone else see your pain. You are not alone with it anymore, Thomas Brennan. And in the fading light of the Arizona desert, with this woman's hand on his, Thomas felt the first crack appear in the ice that had encased his heart for 1,000 days. He knew Pike was still out there. He knew this was far from over. But for the first time, he wasn't fighting against the ghosts of his past. He was fighting for the hope of a future. That night, something changed in room 12 of the Copper Ridge Hotel. Thomas cleaned his Colt, but the ritual was different. For years, it had been an act of maintenance on a tool of vengeance. Tonight, it felt like he was preparing to defend something precious. He wasn't just preparing for Pike. He was preparing to protect the possibility that Ayanna represented. A possibility of peace, of kindness, of a life beyond the gun. He thought about the sheriff's strange warning. She's under the protection of the government and the Apache Nation. It wasn't just about her being an Apache woman. There was something more to her story, something Coltrane knew, and something Pike was clearly after. His instincts, honed by years of survival, were screaming at him that this wasn't just about intimidation. Pike and his men weren't just common thugs. They were searching for something. Our business is with certain individuals who might be hiding there. That's what one of them had said. Fugitives on the reservation? It seemed plausible, but it didn't feel right. It felt like a cover story. What if they weren't looking for a person? What if they were looking for an object? Something valuable enough to risk facing him for. He fell into a restless sleep, his dreams a chaotic mix of fire and smoke from his past, and the calm, steady gaze of Ayana's dark eyes. He woke before dawn with a jolt, a single thought crystal clear in his mind. The sheriff. Coltrane's warning hadn't been a warning to protect Ayana. It had been a warning to keep Thomas away from her, to keep him from interfering. But interfering with what? Was the sheriff trying to keep the peace, or was he trying to keep a secret? He got dressed in the pre-dawn gloom, his mind racing. He had to know more. He couldn't protect Ayana if he was fighting in the dark. He slipped out of the hotel and moved through the sleeping town like a phantom. He didn't go to the trading post. He didn't go to the sheriff's office. He went back to the path they had walked yesterday, to the edge of the desert. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he trusted his gut. And his gut was telling him that Ayana's secrets weren't kept in the town, but out here, in the land of her ancestors. He found the tracks easily in the soft sand, just off the main path. Small footprints. Hers. But they weren't heading back to town. They were leading deeper into the desert, toward a series of rocky mesas that jutted up from the desert floor like stone sentinels. She had come back out here after he'd left her. Why? He followed the tracks, his movements silent and cautious. As the sun began to paint the eastern sky with shades of pink and orange, he saw her. She was standing on a high ledge, but she wasn't alone. She was speaking with a tall, elderly Apache man with a face like a weathered map of the territory. He held a long, cloth-wrapped object in his hands. Thomas was too far away to hear their words, but the reverence in their posture, the way they handled the object, told him everything. This was no casual meeting. This was a ceremony, a transfer. The old man placed the object in Ayana's hands and she bowed her head. As she turned to wrap it in a fresh deerskin, a piece of the cloth fell away, and in the first light of dawn, Thomas saw it. It was the hilt of a Spanish sword, its metal inlaid with gold and glittering with what looked like a large, uncut turquoise stone. It was ancient, priceless, and most definitely not something a simple shopgirl should be carrying around the desert at dawn. And in that instant, everything clicked into place. Pike wasn't looking for a person. He was looking for a treasure. And the sheriff hadn't been warning Thomas off for Ayana's protection. He was warning him off for his own. Sheriff Coltrane wasn't just keeping the peace. He was in on it. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. The law in Copper Ridge wasn't just bent. It was broken. Sheriff Coltrane was playing a double game, pretending to be a pillar of the community while working with a killer like Pike. It explained everything. The sheriff's oddly specific warning, his insistence that Thomas stay away from Ayana. He didn't want a man like Brennan sniffing around, asking questions, potentially upsetting the delicate, corrupt balance he'd established. He needed Copper Ridge to stay quiet, not for the sake of peace, but for the sake of his own greed. Thomas watched from his hiding place among the rocks as Ayana carefully concealed the wrapped sword in a leather satchel and parted ways with the Apache elder. She began the trek back toward town, her steps sure and steady. She was a guardian, a protector of some sacred tribal artifact. The special arrangement with the government was likely a lie, a story Coltrane had concocted to explain her status and keep people from looking too closely. Pike must have gotten a tip, a whisper on the wind about a lost treasure, and tracked it to this town, to this girl. He let her get a safe distance ahead before he started back himself, his mind a whirlwind of strategy. This was no longer a simple matter of protecting a woman from a few bullies. This was a conspiracy, and Ayana was standing right at the center of it, likely unaware of just how deep the danger went. Did she know the sheriff was corrupt? Or did she, like the rest of the town, believe he was an honorable man? He had to assume she didn't know. He had to assume he was the only one who saw the whole ugly picture. He intercepted her on the path, seemingly by accident. "Morning, Miss Yazzie," he said, tipping his hat. She looked startled for a moment, clutching her satchel a little tighter before relaxing when she saw it was him. "Mr. Brennan," she replied, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. "You are an early riser." "The desert is best at this time of day," he said, his eyes flicking to the satchel, "before the heat gets a soul of its own." He fell into step beside her. "I was thinking about what you said yesterday, about seeing the world. Maybe you're right. Maybe I've only been looking at the bad parts." It was a risk, opening up like that, but he needed her to trust him, completely. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "It is never too late to learn to see things differently," she said softly. They walked in silence for a few moments before he spoke again, his voice casual. "Sheriff Coltrane seems to run a tight ship. Keeps the peace." He watched her reaction carefully. She nodded, her expression open and honest. "He has always been fair to my people. A rare thing." So she didn't know. She trusted Coltrane. That made everything 10 times more dangerous for her. "Fair is one thing," Thomas said slowly. "Honest is another." She stopped walking and looked at him, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "What do you mean?" He had to tell her. He had to make her see. "Ayanna," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Pike isn't just looking for fugitives, and Sheriff Coltrane isn't trying to protect you. He's trying to isolate you." He told her what he'd seen. The meeting at dawn, the sword, the pieces falling into place. He watched as her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to a dawning, horrified understanding. She didn't deny it. She didn't have to. The fear in her eyes was real, but it wasn't for herself. "The blade of the ancestors," she whispered, her hand going to the satchel. "It is our history, our covenant with the spirits of this land. If it is lost—" She trailed off, the implications too terrible to voice. "Pike knows about it," Thomas said grimly, "and I'd bet my life Coltrane is the one who told him, for a share of the price." Her face hardened, the soft girl from the trading post disappearing, replaced by a woman of fierce, unyielding resolve. "They will not have it," she said, her voice like steel. "I will die before I let them take it." "No one's dying today," Thomas said, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "But we need a new plan, and we need one now, because they're going to make their move soon, and it's not going to be a quiet conversation in the back of a store." They couldn't go back to town. Not now. The sheriff's office, the hotel, the trading post, they were all part of the trap. Coltrane would be watching, waiting for Ayanna to be alone and vulnerable. They were on their own, 2 people against a corrupt lawman and a gang of ruthless killers. "Is there somewhere we can go?" Thomas asked. "Somewhere safe? Somewhere they won't think to look?" Ayanna thought for a moment, her eyes scanning the rugged landscape around them. "There is a place," she said, "an old line shack, hidden in the canyons north of here. My grandfather used it when he hunted. No one has been there in years." "Lead the way," he said. They moved quickly, leaving the well-worn path and striking out across the open desert. Ayanna moved with a surprising speed and confidence, navigating the treacherous terrain as if she were walking down the main street of Copper Ridge. She was more than just a shop girl, more than just a guardian. She was a child of this land, and it was her greatest ally. As they walked, she told him the story of the blade of the ancestors, how a Spanish conquistador, humbled in battle by her people centuries ago, had gifted them his sword as a sign of respect. Over the generations, it had become a sacred object, a symbol of their resilience, their survival. "It is not made of gold or jewel," she explained. "Its value is not something that can be spent. It is our story. To lose it would be to lose a part of our soul." Thomas listened, and for the first time he understood. He had spent years fighting for revenge, for money, for nothing. Now he was fighting for something that truly mattered. He was fighting for a people's soul. It took them 2 hours of hard travel to reach the canyon. The line shack was cleverly hidden, tucked under a rocky overhang, almost invisible from a distance. It was small and crude, but it was defensible. And more importantly, it was a place Coltrane and Pike wouldn't know existed. Inside, the air was stale and dusty. Thomas immediately checked the perimeter, his mind shifting into the tactical mode that had kept him alive for so long. There was only one main approach. He could watch it from the window. "We need water," he said, "and we need to figure out our next move. They'll realize you're missing soon enough. Coltrane will have the whole town out looking for you, pretending to be concerned." Ayanna pointed to a series of dark stains on the rock wall at the back of the canyon. "There is a spring. It runs underground, but it seeps through the rock there. It is slow, but it is clean water." As Ayanna went to collect water, Thomas took stock of their situation. He had his Colt and about 40 rounds of ammunition. He had his knife. Not much to stand against Pike's gang and a corrupt sheriff. But he also had the element of surprise. They thought Ayanna was a helpless girl. They thought he was just a drifting gunfighter who could be warned off. They had no idea that their two targets were now allies, hidden and waiting. He knew they couldn't just hide forever. They had to take the fight to Coltrane and Pike. They had to expose them. But how? Coltrane held all the power in town. His word was law. It would be their word. The word of a notorious gunfighter and an Apache girl against a respected sheriff. Ayanna returned with a canteen full of water. She saw the grim look on his face. "You are thinking we cannot win," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm thinking the odds are long," he admitted. She sat down across from him, the sacred sword in its satchel resting between them. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "My people have faced long odds for generations, Thomas. We are still here." She reached into her satchel, but she didn't pull out the sword. Instead, she brought out a small, intricately beaded pouch. From it, she took a lump of dark, sticky material and a handful of dried leaves. "What's that?" he asked. She looked up at him, a strange, fierce light in her eyes. "It is a different kind of weapon," she said. "The sheriff and Pike have guns and badges. We have the land, and we have knowledge they do not possess." She began to crush the leaves into the sticky material, her movements precise and practiced. "They think they are hunting me," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "They are about to find out that they are the ones being hunted." Ayanna worked with a focused intensity that mesmerized Thomas. She explained that the leaves were from a rare desert plant, and the sticky substance was a pine pitch mixed with other secret ingredients. "When it burns," she said, "the smoke is thick and disorienting. It confuses the senses, but for those who know what to expect, it is harmless." It was a weapon of misdirection, a tool of the hunted turning the tables on the hunter. They had a plan. It was desperate. It was dangerous. But it was better than waiting to be found. The plan was simple. They couldn't fight Coltrane in his town, where he was the law. They had to draw him out here in the canyons, where the land was their ally. Ayanna would be the bait. "I will go back," she said, her voice firm. "I will let them find me. Not in town, but close by. I will lead them here, to the mouth of the canyon." Thomas immediately hated the idea. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. What if they don't follow? What if they just grab you right there?" "They will follow," she said with certainty. "They want the sword, and they think I am the only one who knows where it is. They won't risk harming me until they have it. They will follow me thinking I am leading them to their prize." It was a massive gamble, but she was right. Pike's greed and Coltrane's arrogance would be their downfall. They would see her as a frightened girl running to her last hiding place. They wouldn't suspect a trap. "I'll be waiting," Thomas said, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "Up on the ridge. When they enter the canyon, I'll have the high ground." "No," Ayanna said, shaking her head. "That is the fight they will be expecting. The fight a man like you would choose. We will fight them my way." She explained the rest of the plan. Thomas would not be on the ridge with his gun. He would be at the narrowest point of the canyon entrance, hidden among the rocks. He would have several small bundles of the smoke mixture Ayanna had prepared. When Pike, Coltrane, and their men were in the canyon, Ayanna would give a signal, the cry of a hawk. That would be Thomas's cue to light the bundles. The thick, acrid smoke would pour into the canyon, cutting off their escape route and throwing them into confusion. In that chaos, Ayanna, who would be deeper in the canyon, would double back, using her knowledge of the terrain to circle around them. It was a plan built on stealth and surprise, not on firepower. It was brilliant, it was terrifying, but it was their only chance. "What about the sword?" Thomas asked, looking at the precious satchel. "Where will it be?" Ayana smiled, a true, confident smile that made her look like a warrior queen. "It will be exactly where they think it is," she said. "With me, it will be the very thing that leads them into the trap." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Ayana showed Thomas the best hiding spots, the secret paths through the rocks. She taught him to recognize the hawk cry she would use. As dusk began to fall, a strange sense of calm settled over them. They were no longer running. They were fighting back. As darkness enveloped the desert, Ayana prepared to leave. She stood before him, the satchel with the sacred sword slung over her shoulder. "Be careful," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "The spirits of my ancestors walk with me tonight," she replied, her voice filled with a strength that humbled him. She reached out and touched his arm. "And they walk with you too, Thomas Brennan." She slipped out of the shack and into the night, a silent shadow moving toward her destiny. Thomas was left alone in the quiet darkness. He was a man who had trusted no one but himself and his gun for years. Tonight he was putting his life and the soul of a people in the hands of a brave woman and her ancient knowledge. He checked his Colt one last time, then moved to his position at the mouth of the canyon. And he waited. The hours crawled by, each one longer than the last. Thomas remained perfectly still in his hiding place, a part of the rock and shadow. The desert night was alive with sounds, the skittering of unseen creatures, the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. He was patient. He had learned patience in the long, lonely stakeouts of his past. But this was different. He wasn't waiting for a killer to show his face. He was waiting for a signal that would mean the woman he cared for, was in mortal danger. Just as the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, he heard it, the distant sound of horses, moving at a steady, determined pace. They were coming. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet dawn. He peered through a crack in the rocks and saw them. 4 riders. Pike was in the lead, his pale hair almost white in the half-light. Beside him rode Sheriff Coltrane, his face set in a grim, determined mask of greed. Behind them were Pike's 2 thugs, and ahead of them, walking on foot, was Ayana. She was playing her part perfectly. She looked tired, defeated, her shoulders slumped. She kept looking back over her shoulder, as if terrified of them. She was leading them directly toward the narrow canyon entrance where he was hidden. Coltrane and Pike were arrogant, confident. They had her. They were moments away from getting their hands on the treasure. They rode into the canyon, the high rock walls echoing the sound of their horses' hooves. They passed his hiding place, so close he could smell the sweat on their horses, the cheap whiskey on Pike's breath. Ayana led them another 50 yards into the canyon, to a place where the path widened slightly. Then she stopped. "It is here," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured fear. "Hidden, in the rocks." Pike dismounted, a greedy smile spreading across his face. "Well, don't just stand there, girl. Show us." As Coltrane and the others began to dismount, Ayana looked up at the sky, and then she let out the cry. It was perfect, the sharp, piercing call of a red-tailed hawk echoing off the canyon walls. It was his signal. Thomas didn't hesitate. He struck a match and lit the fuses on the 3 smoke bundles he had placed. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then with a whoosh, they ignited. A thick, impossibly dense cloud of gray-green smoke billowed out, instantly filling the narrow canyon entrance. It was acrid, choking, and completely opaque. He heard shouts of confusion and alarm from inside the smoke. "What the hell is that? I can't see!" "It's a trap." The plan was working. Their escape was cut off. Now it was Ayana's turn. Thomas peered through the thinning edge of the smoke, his gun drawn, ready. He saw Pike and his men firing blindly into the smoke, their shots ricocheting wildly off the canyon walls. Sheriff Coltrane was trying to restore order, shouting commands that were lost in the chaos and coughing. But where was Ayana? He saw her for a split second, a shadow darting behind a large boulder, not deeper into the canyon, but back toward the smoke, back toward them. She was circling around, just as she'd planned. Then something went wrong. The youngest of Pike's men, panicking, stumbled out of the smoke, his eyes streaming, coughing violently. He saw Thomas. For a second, they just stared at each other. Then the kid raised his pistol. Thomas fired first. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The kid went down. But the element of surprise was gone. "Brennan!" Pike roared from inside the smoke. "He's here! He's at the entrance!" The remaining two gunmen and Coltrane now knew where he was. Bullets began to slam into the rocks around him, chipping off stone fragments that stung his face. He was pinned down. He had to move. He fired 2 shots back into the smoke to give himself cover, then scrambled from his hiding place, rolling behind a different set of rocks. He was exposed. The smoke was beginning to thin. In a minute, they'd have a clear shot at him. The plan had been brilliant, but it had relied on perfection. One unlucky break, and it was all falling apart. He was trapped between the canyon wall and 3 angry men with guns. And then from above, he heard a sound that was not a gunshot. It was a sharp whistling sound, followed by a solid thump. One of Pike's men, who had been taking aim at Thomas's position, suddenly cried out and staggered back, a feathered shaft protruding from his shoulder. He looked up in disbelief, and Thomas looked up too. Standing on the canyon rim, silhouetted against the rising sun, was Ayanna. But she wasn't the girl from the trading post anymore. In her hands, she held a short, powerful Apache bow, another arrow already knocked on the string. She hadn't circled around on the ground. She had climbed the damn canyon wall in the dark. The hunters had just become the hunted, in a way they could never have imagined. The sight of Ayanna on the ridge, bow in hand, changed the entire dynamic of the fight. She wasn't bait. She was a warrior. Pike and Coltrane, momentarily stunned, stared up at her. That moment of hesitation was all Thomas needed. He burst from behind his cover, firing his Colt. His first shot caught Pike's remaining thug in the leg, sending him sprawling to the ground, screaming. His second shot was aimed at the sheriff. He didn't shoot to kill. He shot the gun right out of Coltrane's hand, the impact spinning the man around and sending him crashing to his knees. Now it was just Pike, and Pike was smart. He didn't try to shoot at Thomas or the warrior on the ridge. He did the one thing they didn't expect. He lunged for the satchel, which Ayanna had dropped when the shooting started. He scooped it up and, using the wounded Coltrane as a momentary shield, scrambled for the cover of the rocks deeper in the canyon. "The sword!" Ayanna cried out from above. "He has the sword!" Thomas didn't hesitate. He ran past the wounded men plunging into the canyon after Pike. This was it, the final confrontation. He found Pike backed into a small alcove, the satchel clutched in one hand and his pistol in the other. His charming smile was gone, replaced by a desperate, animalistic snarl. "That's far enough, Brennan," he yelled, his voice echoing in the narrow space. "One more step and I'll put a bullet in you." "It's over, Pike," Thomas said, his own gun steady, aimed at Pike's chest. "You've got nowhere to run." "I've got the prize," Pike spat, shaking the satchel. "That's all that matters. I'll still get paid." "You think this is about money?" Thomas asked, taking a slow step forward. "You came into a peaceful town. You threatened a good woman. You corrupted the law. This ends now." Pike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You talk a big game for a washed-up killer. I heard what happened in Tombstone. Your wife, your kid. You couldn't even protect them. What makes you think you can protect this savage and her shiny stick?" The words were meant to hurt, to throw him off balance. And 3 days ago they would have. They would have sent him into a blind rage. But something was different now. The rage was still there, a cold, hard knot in his gut. But it wasn't blind anymore. It was focused. "You're right," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I failed them. I will carry that failure to my grave. But I'm not going to fail her." He took another step. Pike's eyes widened in panic. He raised his pistol, but Thomas was already moving. He didn't fire his gun. He dove to the side as Pike's shot boomed through the alcove, the bullet screaming past his ear. Thomas hit the ground, rolled, and came up, launching himself at Pike. They crashed against the rock wall, a desperate, brutal struggle for survival. Pike was strong, but Thomas was fueled by 3 years of suppressed grief and a newfound sense of purpose. He slammed Pike's gun hand against the rock until the pistol clattered to the ground. Pike snarled and drew a knife. He slashed wildly, cutting a deep gash in Thomas's forearm. Thomas grunted in pain, but didn't back down. He grabbed Pike's wrist, twisting it until the man screamed and dropped the knife. Then with all his strength, Thomas drove his fist into Pike's jaw. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. Pike's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped to the ground unconscious. It was over. Thomas stood there, breathing heavily, his arm bleeding freely, his knuckles raw. He picked up the satchel. He had the sword. He had won. He turned and saw Ayanna climbing down the last few feet of the rock face, her bow slung over her back. She ran to him, her eyes wide with concern. "You're hurt," she said, her hands hovering over his bleeding arm. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice was shaky with adrenaline and relief. They looked at each other, the chaos of the fight fading away, leaving only the two of them standing in the quiet canyon. "You were incredible," he said, looking at her with a new sense of awe. "You never told me you were a warrior." She gave him a small, weary smile. "You never asked." Behind them, they heard a groan. Sheriff Coltrane was stirring, trying to sit up, clutching his shattered hand. His face was a mixture of pain, disbelief, and utter defeat. He had lost everything. His reputation, his power, his freedom. He looked at Thomas and Ayanna, the gunfighter and the Apache girl who had brought him down. "What now?" he rasped. Thomas looked at Ayanna. This was her victory as much as his. She had the right to decide his fate. Ayanna walked over to the disgraced sheriff. She didn't look at him with hatred or anger. She looked at him with a profound, quiet sadness. "Now," she said, her voice clear and strong, "you will face justice. Not just the white man's justice, but the justice of the people you betrayed." The future was uncertain. They had to get the wounded men back to town and expose Coltrane. It would be complicated and it would be messy. But as Thomas stood there beside Ayanna, the sacred sword safe in his hands, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just passing through anymore. He was home. Getting back to Copper Ridge was a grim affair. They tied up Pike and his wounded man and slung them over their horses. Sheriff Coltrane, clutching his broken hand, walked ahead of them, his head bowed in shame. When they rode onto the main street, the townspeople came out of their homes and businesses, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. They saw their sheriff, defeated. They saw the feared gunfighter, bloody but standing tall. And they saw the Apache girl, walking beside him, no longer just a shop girl, but a protector. The story came out piece by piece. Deputy Hayes, though young, was an honest man. When presented with the evidence and the confessions of Pike's men, he did his duty. He locked Sheriff Coltrane in his own jail cell. The territorial marshal was sent for. Justice, real justice, had come to Copper Ridge. A few days later, Thomas stood with Ayanna on the same rocky outcrop where she had first shown him how to see the world differently. His arm was bandaged, and he was sore. But for the first time in years, his soul felt clean. "What will you do now?" she asked, her eyes on the distant mountains. "The stories about you will change. They will not call you the devil of the dust anymore." He thought about that. He had spent so long defined by his past, by his violence. Maybe it was time to build a new definition. "I was offered a job," he said quietly. "Deputy Hayes. He thinks I might be good at it. He's going to be the new sheriff. And he says he needs a man who understands the difference between law and justice." Ayanna turned to him, a radiant smile spreading across her face. "And what did you tell him?" He looked at her, at the woman who had seen the man behind the monster and had offered him a kindness that had saved his life. "I told him I had to check with my partner first." Her smile widened. "It seems like a job with long odds," she teased. "I'm getting used to those," he said. And he finally smiled back, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Besides, I hear this town has more to offer than most." The past would always be a part of him. The scars, both visible and invisible, would remain. But they were no longer the sum of who he was. They were just a part of his story. A story that was no longer about a man alone, but about a man who had found something and someone worth fighting for. He had ridden into Copper Ridge a ghost, a man running from his past. He would stay as a guardian, a man building a future. And it all started with a simple, unexpected smile. If you enjoyed this story of a man's journey from darkness to redemption, and the strong woman who guided him there, do me a favor and hit that like button. And for more tales of justice and unexpected heroes from the forgotten corners of history, make sure you subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next.